Welcome to this YSL DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series, we're going to cover the values, HasOneValue and SelectedValue functions. So the video is all about how you reference column values in measures, what the problem with doing that is, and why the values function resolves that problem. We'll explain how to use the HasOneValue function to test for whether a column has just a single unique value and why that's useful, and then how to make that entire process a little bit more succinct and easy to write by using the SelectedValue function. Then we'll look at a few practical examples for all these techniques, looking at how to create dynamic titles for visuals, including cards and titles for charts, how to work with drill-through filters and then show unique selected values on multiple different pages, and then finally, how we create a disconnected slicer system and how the values function helps us with that. So plenty to do in this one, let's get started. To get started, I've already imported our standard list of movies from an Excel workbook, and as usual, I'll drop a link in the video description so that you can download this same workbook yourself and follow along with the video if you'd like to. Just before we start creating any measures, I want to add a simple visual to this report page. So I'm going to insert a table visual, and into that table I'm going to insert the full name field from the director table, and then the film ID field from the film table. So we get a count of films made by each director. Let's just tidy things up a little bit. I'm going to rename the two fields in the table to director name and then number of films. And just so that we can see a little more clearly what's going on, let's do a bit of basic formatting as well. So in the format panel, I'm going to search for the font properties and I'm going to change the global font size up to say 14. And then I'm also going to change the total option on the table. So I'm just going to temporarily disable the total row so we don't see a grand total just for the moment. Let's just resize the table a bit so we can see what's going on, and then we're ready to start creating some measures. For the first measure, I'd like to do something which sounds like it should be quite simple. I want to concatenate the full name of the director with the number of films they've made to construct a longer sentence like Adam McKay directed 2 films. It's not the most practically useful example, but it is a nice way to introduce the problem of referencing the value of a column in a measure. We have done things like this previously with calculated columns. In an earlier video in the series, we looked at working with text in calculated columns. And let's just have a quick reminder of how easy that is. If I switch back into the report and then select my data view, if I head into my director table, I'd like to create a new column which says Steven Spielberg was born on 18 December 1946, for example. So let's insert a new column into the table. I'm going to call this new column born on and make it equal to a reference to the full name column. If I just start typing in the column name, you'll see it appears nicely in the IntelliSense, and I can insert that quickly to pick out the value of that column for each row. Then I can concatenate some literal text, was born on, and then concatenate the value of the DOB column. So the reason this is so easy and we get lots of help with the IntelliSense is that in a calculated column, the expression is evaluated in a row context. So this expression gets evaluated for every individual row in this table, one at a time. And on each row of the table, we have access to the value of each column using the row context. So if I insert that column, we'll see a sensible result for every single row. The problem with trying to do this same sort of thing in a measure is that a measure doesn't have a row context we can use to access the individual values of a column. Let's demonstrate that by heading back to the report view and try to create the measure we described earlier. I'm going to right-click on the All Measures table and choose New Measure. And I'm going to call this one Director Films. And then I'm going to make it equal to start with, a reference to the full name column of the director table. And you can see already the lack of help from the IntelliSense list there is a pretty bad sign. Let's try and force it. Let's try to type in a reference to the director table manually, and then in some square brackets refer to the full name column and close the square brackets. Again, the grayed out text there for the full name column is a bad sign, and when I hit enter to create the measure, we receive an error message complaining about not being able to determine a single value for the full name column in the director table. And this can happen when you reference a column in a measure that contains many values without specifying some sort of aggregation to get a single result. So at the moment, that reference to the full name column is trying to reference every single row in the entire director table. Those rows will be filtered, of course, when we do finally add our measure to a visualization. The rows will be filtered based on the filter context. So what we need to do first, though, is we need some function which will extract the unique or distinct values for the full name column in whichever filter context the measure finds itself in. And there are two functions we can use to do that in DAX. They're called distinct and they're called values. So if I say director films equals distinct, you can see, if I just clear this list, the distinct function returns a one-column table that contains the unique or distinct values in a column. If I replace distinct with the values function instead, values there, not value, again, the values function returns a single column table of unique values. There is a subtle difference in what the values and distinct functions do, but that difference is not important for anything we're going to do in this video. In this video, we can interchange values with distinct and they'll do the same thing. So I'm going to use the values function to return a reference to the full name column. And you can hopefully see here now the IntelliSense is working correctly. I can pick out the director full name, close the round brackets, and then hit enter. Now we still haven't added our measure to a visualization yet, so when I add this measure into this table, the filter context generated by this table contains one single director for each data point. So if I drag my director films measure into that table, I get the name of that director, finally. From that point, I can then start concatenating my extra text. I'm going to say and directed, and then I'm going to use the count rows function to count the number of rows in the film table. Count rows is an aggregation function, so I don't need to worry about referencing the values of the film table. I can just count the rows in it, and then I concatenate the word film or films to the end of that. So if I were to update that measure now, I should see a sensible message for each individual director generated by the filter context of this visual. Okay, so now that we know how to reference the values of a column in a measure, let's start building towards some practically useful examples of that. For the next step, I'd like to create a new measure which, for directors who have only one film, shows the name of that film. Otherwise, it's just going to show the count of films made by that director. So let's create a new measure. I'm going to call this one single film title. And I'm going to make this one equal to, as we know, I can't refer directly to the title column of my film table. I have to use either the values or distinct function to get access to the values of that column. So I'm going to say values, open some round brackets, film title, and then close the round brackets. Now I can happily create this measure at this point with no problem. But if I attempt to add this measure into my table visual, I'm going to encounter another problem. For directors who have directed only one film, there is only one single unique value to return, so that's great. But for directors with multiple films, the values function returns multiple items, multiple values, and I can't simply display those multiple values in a single cell in a table visual. So there we go, we get an error when we try to add it into the visual. What I'd like to be able to do is check how many values the film title contains, and if there is only one, I want to display that film title. Otherwise, I want to display the count of films. So in order to do that, we can use an if function in our measure. Let's just take the values function down a row or two. And I'm going to begin my measure with an if function. On the next row, I'm going to use a function called HasOneValue. There's HasOneValue and HasOneFilter. There is again a subtle distinction between those two. I'm going to come back to HasOneFilter a little later in the video. For now, I want to check if HasOneValue film title, and then close around brackets. If that's true, I want to show the value of that film title. Otherwise, I want to show, let's say, count rows film, and then concatenate the word films to the end. Okay, so if we update that measure now, we'll see that the measure does work in this particular visual, where there is only one unique value for the film for a particular filter context. The title of that film appears. Otherwise, we get the text that shows the count of film rows and the word films. We can see this same problem with the values function returning multiple values in the original measure. If we switch back to the director films measure, we're currently returning the unique or distinct value for each director full name based on the filter context of this visual. And because in this visual I've added the director name column to the table, the filter context contains just one single value for the director name. But what if we turned on the total row for the table again? If I switch back to the format pane and find the totals section and re-enable my totals, then we get the same problem we've just seen with the multiple film names being returned. So again, what I would want to do here with the values of director is I'd only want to return the director full name if there is only one director full name. Let's just break up our code a little bit by inserting some new lines. I'm going to use Shift and Enter to throw a few new lines in my code. And then I'm going to take the values function down a couple of lines as well. And then use that same basic pattern if, and then has one value, and then refer to the director full name field. If that's true, I want to show the value of that director full name. Otherwise, I want to show some literal text. Let's say multiple directors or something simple like that. I can then close around brackets and concatenate to the end of that the rest of my text, directed, and then the number of films. And if I now update my measure to include that total row, on the row where there is not just one value for the director full name, it shows the words multiple directors instead. I'd just like to quickly describe the difference between the HasOneValue and HasOneFilter functions. This is mainly for the sake of completeness in this video, rather than for anything particularly practically useful at this point. So both functions are designed to detect if a particular column has been filtered down to one unique value. So in director films, we're checking if the full name column of the director table has been filtered down to one unique value. And the HasOneFilter function does exactly the same thing in this case. I can change HasOneValue to HasOneFilter and still see the same end result in this measure, in this particular table visual. If I try to do the same thing with my single film title measure, things don't work in quite the same way. So if I change HasOneValue to HasOneFilter, then the results I see in this table visual will change. Rather than showing the unique film title that we filtered down to, we're now showing the generic one films message. So the difference between HasOneValue and HasOneFilter is based upon how that filter has been applied to the measure. Is it a direct filter or is it a cross filter? Now, to understand this, you need to know a little bit about the data model you're working with. So in this table visual, the filter context that's being applied, the filter that's affecting both of our measures, is applied by the director name or the full name column of the director table. If we look at our data model, you can see that the director table contains the full name column and the film table contains the title column. So if we filter anything by the full name column in our table visual in the report, then any column that belongs to the director table would be directly filtered by that full name column. If we're filtering our film titles based on full name, then that's applied via a cross filter. So you can see this relationship between the direct table and the film table. The filter applied by full name propagates through this relationship onto the film table. So that's a cross filter. So the basic difference between our HasOneValue and HasOneFilter functions is that HasOneFilter only detects direct filters on this column. So the film title column has been filtered via the full name column of the direct table. So that's not a direct filter, therefore we need to use the HasOneValue function, which does detect cross filters. For our original measure, the director films, we can happily switch between HasOneFilter or HasOneValue. It makes no difference because the field or the column that's creating the filter is in the same table as the column we're testing for the unique values within. So it's a subtle technical difference and it does affect the measures we've created so far, but for the rest of this video it won't make a difference because we're about to get away from using HasOneValue or HasOneFilter. So this basic logic that we've seen used a couple of times so far, where we check if something has one value, then return that value, otherwise return something else, is such a common pattern in DAX that there's actually a dedicated function to make writing this a lot simpler. I'm just going to strip back the if HasOneValue and Values function, and I'm going to replace that with a reference to the SelectedValue function. The job of SelectedValue is exactly what we've just written there. If HasOneValue values, otherwise something else. So SelectedValue has a single compulsory parameter, the column that you want to return a unique, distinct value from. So I'm going to say SelectedValue film title. And if there is a single unique value in that column, that value will be returned. The second parameter is optional. If I don't have the second parameter here, or the second argument to the alternate result parameter, then the function returns blank. Otherwise, it will return the value I specify in the alternate result parameter. So, much simpler, but the end result is absolutely identical to the if HasOneValue values combination. And I could do exactly the same thing with the director films measure. It'll replace the HasOneFilter function as well. So the SelectedValue function works with cross filters and direct filters equally. So I'm going to get rid of, let's see, everything from if HasOneFilter values, and I'm going to replace that with SelectedValue. And then on the next line, I'm going to refer to my full name column from my director table. Otherwise, I'm going to try to return the results of multiple directors, and then concatenate to the end of that, directed this many films. So again, exactly the same results, just with much less code and much easier to write. So from this point on, we'll be using SelectedValue for most of the examples through to the end of the video. Okay, so everything we've done here so far has just been to get used to the concept of referencing values in measures. Now let's have a look at where we might start to use that sort of technique in a practical context. I'm going to add a new page to my report, and the first visual I'm going to add to this page is going to be a slicer, which allows me to select one of my 24 different genres from the genre table. So let's insert that genre slicer. I'll just resize that so I can see all of the values. And then next door to the slicer, I'm going to insert a table visual. And inside there, I'm going to add a few fields from my film table. Let's go with the title. And I'll also include, say, the release date. And I want to see the release date as a date, not as the date hierarchy. So in the columns bucket of the field well here, I'm going to use the drop-down list to select release date rather than hierarchy. Then let's say I'm also going to include the runtime minutes field. And then from my certificate table, I'm going to insert the certificate column. Let's just resize the table so it's filling most of the width of the page and then about half of the height. And then in the area just below the table, I'm going to insert a basic column chart, a clustered column chart. And into there, I'm going to insert my certificate field from the certificate table. And then from the film table, I'll insert the film ID to get a count of films by each certificate. What I'd now like to do is just rename the page so that it's called Films by Certificate. Okay, so at the moment I can happily then select genres from my genre slicer, and the data in my table and in my chart change, of course, to respond to the selection I've made. What my table and chart don't really do, though, is they don't show me how the data has been filtered, so it's not immediately obvious unless I look over at my slicer to see which item I've selected. It's not immediately obvious how the chart and the table have been filtered. So I'd like to create a measure that I can display in the title of these two visuals the value of the slicer that I've selected. So in order to do that, I'm going to go to my measures table, right click and choose new measure, and then I'm going to call this new measure genre title and make it equal to selected value, and then refer to the genre field of my genre table. And if I happen to have selected multiple genres, then I want to display some text as multiple genres. If I then just close the round brackets and hit enter, I can now use that measure to assign a title to my other two visuals. So let's select my table visual first and then head into the format pane. And then in the general page of the format properties, I can find the title property and enable that. And then if I expand that category, there's an FX button here to launch the conditional formatting dialog box. In conditional formatting for certain properties, you can reference field values. And I'm going to reference in my all measures table the genre title measure. I'll then click OK, and I'll now see that currently I've got the word multiple genres displayed in the title at the top. I'm then going to go to my chart and do basically the same thing. So in the title text property, I can click the FX button, and then from the drop down list, choose all measures and then genre title, and then click OK. So if I now select single individual genres, we'll see that that genre name appears at the top of my other two visuals. And if I select multiple genres, then it shows multiple genres. I can do the same sort of thing here to pretty much any sort of visual. In a title, I can display the results of my measure, and some visuals even support this measure being displayed in the visual itself. So I'm going to use a little bit of space next door to my table, and I'm going to insert a card visual. So if I insert my card, and then I'm just going to drag my genre title field directly onto that card. And again, if I now just choose a single individual genre, that genre name appears. If I select multiple genres, then the word multiple genres appears. I'm just going to tidy up my card visual a little bit by disabling the subtitle there, the category label property, just so it only shows the value of my measure. And then I meant to do this earlier, I didn't delete the delete me field from my all measures table, so let's just right click and delete that from the model at this point, just to get rid of that. So there we go. So some basic practical examples of using a measure to return the selected value to display that information to the end user. Now, obviously in this example, the dynamic titles are a little bit redundant because we can see the actual genres we've selected from the slicer on the same page. But what if that wasn't the case? Let's start by duplicating our Films by Certificate page. I'm going to right click and choose Duplicate Page. Then I'm going to change the name of that page so it's called Films by Region. Then we're just going to modify a couple of our fields. I'm going to select my multiple genres chart, and I'm going to take out the certificate field and replace that with the region field from my region table. I'm then going to do the same sort of thing in my table visual at the top. I'm going to take away the certificate and display the region instead. What I'm now going to do is head back to page 1, and I'm going to change this page to call it Filter Page. I'm then going to remove the table visual we've been using on that page and replace it with a gigantic slicer just for selecting genres. So I'm going to insert a slicer onto the page, make it occupy most of the page size, and then insert the genre field into it. And then rather than a boring old list of tick boxes to tick, I'm going to use some basic formatting to change that slicer into a set of buttons. So in the Format pane, in the Slicer Settings category, we've got the Orientation property that we can set to horizontal, and that's a little bit more interesting. Okay, so I've currently got a slicer for genres on each of the 3 pages of this report. What I'd like to now do is hide the slicer on the 2 films pages, display it only on the filter page, but make sure that the filter page affects the hidden slicers on these other 2 pages. So to do that, I need to head up to the View tab in my ribbon and choose the Sync Slicers option. So I can now select my genre slicer on page 1, and I can see that at the moment I've got 2 columns in the Sync Slicers panel. The second column with the little eye symbol indicates whether the slicer is visible on each of the pages, and then the little swirly arrow symbol there indicates whether those slicers are synchronized. So does selecting a value in a slicer on that page affect slicers on the other pages? I'm going to start by checking all of the boxes for all 3 pages so that every slicer on each page, or each of the slicers on this page referring to the genre, will affect each other. And then I'm going to uncheck the boxes in the second column for films by certificate and films by region. So now if I just quickly select those 2 pages, you can see that that slicer is no longer visible. And that means that if I go back to my filter page and I choose a particular genre, let's go for, let's go for animation. If I look back at films by certificate, we can see that although we don't know which genre has been selected because we can't see the slicer, it is now visible in the dynamic titles of the chart and table and card, and also on the films by region page as well. So one reason you might consider using dynamic titles is to set up a Sync Slicers style report where you've got all of your slicers on one single filter page that affects multiple other pages in the same report. Another technique you can use to do something similar to Sync Slicers, where you select an item on one page of your report to filter items on another page, is to use something called Drill Through. I'm just going to make my slicers on all pages visible again, and then I'm going to unsynchronize them by unchecking all of those boxes. Then I'm going to hide my Sync Slicers panel, in fact close it down entirely. Then I'm going to head back to my Films by Certificate page, and I'm going to remove my slicer on that page. And I'm going to do the same thing on the Films by Region page as well. I'm going to get rid of that slicer entirely. Back on my filter page, I'm now going to convert my slicer into some other kind of visual. Let's use a basic chart. It doesn't really matter what type. I'm going to go with a clustered bar chart to show for each genre, let's say the number of films. Let's include the film ID, and that shows me the count of films in each genre. What I'd now like to be able to do is use this chart to drill through to the other pages in this report and filter each page by the genre that I've selected in the chart. And to do that, I need to use the drill through options. Now at the moment, if I just go to the Data Drill tab with this chart selected, there is an ability to switch on the drill through option. So I'm just going to click on the drill through option temporarily. And that means that if I click on a column in my chart, it will show me any available drill through actions. Currently, there aren't any because I haven't configured it yet, of course. So let's just disable the drill through option just temporarily. Now the chart just behaves normally where I can select a column in the chart to filter other pages, other visuals on the same page. So to set up the drill through, if I head back to my Films by Certificate page, it's easiest to do this if you don't have any other visuals selected, because in the field well of your visualizations panel, you can see a little bucket to add drill through fields here. All I'm going to do is drag in the genre field into the add drill through fields here section. That adds an extra little visual onto this report page, a little back button that we're going to click on shortly to get back to our filter page. Just before I do that, I'm going to go over to the Films by Region page and then do the exact same thing. In the Add Drill Through Fields here bucket, I'm going to add in the genre field, and again you'll see a little back button appears there as well. So if I now go back to my filter page, I can enable drill through on this chart in a couple of different ways. Even without enabling the drill through feature, I can right click on any column to find my drill through option and then choose either of the two other pages that are displayed in this list. So any page which has the genre field in the drill through filters bucket, I can drill through to see films of that genre. And now my dynamic title indicates to me which genre I've just selected. To get back to the main page, I can hold down the Control key and click the back button. When the report's been deployed, of course, you won't need to hold down the Control key in order to do that. Another way to do the same thing, if I go back to my filter page chart, go to the Data Drill tab in the ribbon and click Drill Through. If I didn't want to have to right click on the visual, I can now just normal left click to select and then drill through films by certificate or films by region. And then again, it shows me the name of the genre that I've just selected. Again, Control click will take me back to the main menu page. In the deployed version of the report, you will probably want to hide the films by certificate and films by region pages so that the only way to reach them is via the drill through. So I can do that by right clicking on each of the other pages and choosing to hide them. Of course, in the design view here, you'll still be able to see those pages to make changes to them. But when the report's been published, the end user can only reach those by drilling through from this page. So there we go, there's the basic drill through system setup, and another practical use for these dynamic titles using the SelectedValue function. So this basic drill through works well enough, providing the end user knows that it's there. And I guess my biggest problem with it is that just by looking at this page, it isn't immediately obvious that there's any action I can perform. Of course, I get a clue if I hover the mouse cursor over a data point in the chart. The tooltip tells me I can right click to drill through. And I guess I could provide some instructions for the end user to that end by drawing a text box and writing some narrative text in it. But that feels a bit clunky. I prefer a more streamlined solution. So I'd like to create a button on this page that allows me to drill through to the certificate page, and then another button to drill through to the region page. So to start with that, let's head up to the Insert tab in the ribbon, head to the Buttons tool, and I'm going to start by drawing a blank button on the page. I'll just reposition that over towards the right hand side of my chart, then increase its size so I can see a little more clearly what we're doing. And then let's set up a few formatting properties from the Format pane. In the Style category, let's set the text for that button to be on, and then let's type in something like click to see films by certificate. I'll just bump up the font size there as well to make it a bit more readable. And then more importantly, let's set up the action that's applied when we click on the button. So I'm going to head to the action category and enable that. And then in the action section, set the type of action to a drill through and the destination to be the films by certificate page. Okay, so at the moment, the button doesn't do anything. You can see the text is sort of grayed out. And if I try to Control click to do anything, nothing happens. Because this button relies on me having just one single value selected in my chart. I think at the moment I've still got the old drill through feature still enabled, so at the moment clicking on a column or a data point in the chart just shows me the drill through menu. So I'm going to disable that first of all by selecting the chart, heading to the Data Drill menu in the ribbon, and then disabling that drill through. Now when I click on a data point in my chart, I'll see that the button becomes activated. So selecting science fiction, for example, now activates the button, and pressing Control and clicking on the button will drill through to the relevant page, filtered for the genre that I had selected. So that's the basic system working. Next, I'd like to improve the button by making the text displayed on it dynamic. So when I do have a single genre selected, to begin with I just want to show that genre's name. Otherwise, I want the button to say, pick a single genre first. That sort of thing is already happening. I don't know if you can see there in the tooltip that appears when I hover the mouse cursor over the button. So when I don't have anything selected, it says I need to select a single data point from genre. And when I do have a single data point selected, the tooltip changes to show me that I can Control and click now to drill through. So I basically just want something similar to happen for the button text. Let's do that by creating a measure using the SelectedValue function first. So I'm going to right click my all measures table, choose new measure, and I'm going to call this new measure something like certificate button text, and make it equal to selected value, trying to return the single unique value from the genre column first. And if I don't have a single value selected in the genre column, then I'm going to show some literal text. Pick a single genre first. Okay, so there's the entire measure created. Now I need to assign that measure to the appropriate property of the button. So I'll select my button, head back to the style category in the format pane, and if for the text property, click the FX button to display the conditional formatting dialog box. Again, I'm going to use the drop-down list here to select my new measure, certificate button text. Click OK. And if I don't have a single genre selected, my button text says pick a single genre first. If I do have a single genre selected, that genre's name appears in the button text. I'd like to make one final improvement to the button text so that when I do have a single genre selected, it says something like click to see science fiction films by certificate, just to give the user a clue as to what's actually going to happen when they click the button. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to concatenate some text before the selected genre and some other text after the selected genre name. That makes it quite tricky to use the SelectedValue function. If I head back to the measure definition of certificate button text, you'll see that the SelectedValue function, if I just quickly force the tooltip to reappear by removing and replacing the open round bracket symbol there, the first parameter of SelectedValue requires just a reference to a column name. So I can't reliably create an expression in that argument. You'll see if I try to concatenate any text to the genre, if I said something like click to see, and then concatenate that to the genre field, the red squiggly and the grayed out column name indicates that that's not going to work. The exact message's parameter is not the correct type. I have an expression, not a reference to a column. So to make this work, what we're going to do instead is use the HasOneValue function. So I'm going to remove the SelectedValue function first, and I'm going to use an if function, and then in front of where it says genre, I'm going to say HasOneValue, open some round brackets, and then close the round brackets after the genre name. If that's the case, what I want to do is say click to see, and then I want to concatenate the single selected genre name. So I guess I could use the SelectedValue function here, but it seems a little bit unnecessary when I can just use values by itself. So let's go for values genre. And then I can concatenate to the end of that films by certificate. Okay, if I type in a comma at the end of that, if I don't have a single value selected for genre, it will say pick a single genre first. So this is one situation where the if HasOneValue values combination is a little better than SelectedValue, because it means I can be a little bit more flexible about what value I display by concatenating more text around the single distinct value returned. So if I just update my measure now and have a look back at my measure, my button text, if I have science fiction selected, it says click to see science fiction films by certificate, and that will of course change based on the selected value. If I have more than one genre selected or don't have any single genre selected, have them all, it says pick a single genre first. At this point, it's fairly easy to create a second button to show films by region. I'm just going to select my pick a single genre button, copy it and paste it with Control-C, then Control and V, reposition that button, and then we can just create a copy of our measure as well. So I'm going to head to the certificate button text measure, copy all of the text out of that, and then create a new measure, and then paste in all the text I've just copied, and call this one region button text. And then just modify the text displayed to say films by region rather than films by certificate. And then two properties of my button that I then need to change. I'll need to change the text assigned to it. So I'm going to go to the style category and find the FX button for the text property. Change the measure I'm using from certificate button text to region button text, and hit OK. And then of course I need to change the action so that clicking on the button will take me not to the Films by Certificate page, but to the Films by Region page instead. So now we can select a single genre in our chart and either choose to see the adventure films by certificate or the adventure films by region by clicking the appropriate button. Now the main problem that we have with this approach, of course, is that the more pages we have to drill through to, the more buttons and the more measures we're going to need. So I'd like a slightly more streamlined system where we have one visual that allows us to select the genre we want to see and another visual that allows us to select the page we want to drill through to. To make that work, what we're going to need to do is create a disconnected table. So it's going to be a table that's part of the data model, but not joined with any relationships to anything else in there. It purely exists so that we can select a single value from it. There are several ways we can build this table, but just for simplicity, I'm going to do this by entering data manually. So to start with this approach, I'm going to head to the Home tab in the ribbon and then choose the Enter Data tool. And that'll display a dialog box allowing me to type in the values I want to store in my table. So I'm going to create two columns. I'm going to first of all rename column number 1. I'm going to call this one Page Label. It doesn't really matter what value it gets displayed in here. This is purely to display information in maybe the slicer or the table visual. It's the thing the user will see and they will click on to select the page. So I'm just going to say here certificate and then region as the two values the user will see. Then I'm going to add a second column and I'm going to call this one page name. Now it is very important what we put in here. The values we insert into the page name column have to match exactly the names of the pages we're going to drill through to. So I'm going to say films by certificate, attempt to spell that correctly, and then also films by region. We'll talk about how we can modify these values if we get it wrong or if we wanted to add new ones a little later on, but for now that will do. So what I'm then going to do is rename the table so it's got a better name. Let's call it Page Picker will do, I think. And then we can load that table into our data model to create a way for the user to select their page. So there it goes, loading into the data model, 2 rows loaded. And when that's been done, let's just add a slicer to this page and then assign the page label field to that slicer. So you can see the names we've written into the first column are available there. And I want to make sure that I can only select a single value from this slicer. So I'm going to head to the Format pane for the Slicer tool, head to Slicer Settings, then the Selection category in there, and enable the Single Select option. So I must always have one value selected. Next, we can create a measure to return the value for the page name field for whichever page label we've selected. So if I choose certificate from the slicer, then I want to return the corresponding value in the page picker table for films by certificate. To do that, we can use either values or distinct or selected value. Let's create a measure using the SelectedValue function for this example. I'm going to create a new measure in the All Measures table, and I'm going to call this one Selected Page Name, and then simply use selected value and then reference my page picker page name. So now that we have our measure, we can create a new button that has an action which will drill through to whichever of the pages we've selected based on the value of the genre that we've selected. So I'm going to draw a new button onto this page. I'll head back to the Insert tab in the ribbon, head to the Buttons tool, draw a new blank button, and then reposition that just underneath that slicer. We'll deal with the text in just a moment, but it's the action that I'm really most interested in. So if I enable the action on the button and then set the drill through action type to drill through, and then choose the destination, not by picking a page from the drop-down list, but once again by using the FX button to assign a measure. To do this dynamically, so from the All Measures category, I'm going to pick my Selected Page Name measure. So once I click OK, we'll see that if we pick a single genre, I'll go with martial arts, it enables the button, and if I have certificate selected as my page label, I can control click on my button to go through to the films by certificate page. But if I come back and pick the same genre, but choose the region page label, I can control click on my new button to drill through to the films by region page instead. So now it's just a case of tidying up the appearance of all these things. I'm going to head back to the slicer first of all. I'm going to change the little category label there, the field name, to say see films by, and then whichever of the two options I select. And then for the button text, I want it to say something similar to what we've done with our previous two buttons. In fact, I'm going to go back and select my region button measure first. I'm going to copy all of the text from that measure and then create another new measure based on it. So I'm going to say, I'll call this one drill through button text, just generically drill through. And then if the genre has one value, I want to say click to see that genre name, films by, but not necessarily by region, by whichever the value of the selected page label is. So I'm going to use another ampersand and then say values and then refer to my page picker, page label field. Again, I'm able to do this because I know that I've only got the ability to select one of the two different page labels. So values is a safe function to use in this case. Alternatively, I could use the SelectedValue function, or I could say if HasOneValue page picker page label, all the same techniques we've used up to this point in the video so far. Anyway, I'm going to assume that I can only select one single item from that slicer, so we'll stick with this values function just for the time being. And then if I create that new measure, head back to my button, style text, and enable the text, which is what I was trying to do there, and then hit the FX button next to the text property so that we can select that drill through button text measure. So at the moment, let's also just increase the font size there to make it a bit more readable. Pick a single genre first, and if I pick any genre and pick a particular see films by option, it'll read correctly. See fantasy films by region, choose certificate instead, see fantasy films by certificate, choose a different genre, it'll update the genre as well. So at this point I think we could just delete these other two buttons, we shan't need those. We've got a much more simplistic system for the end user where they pick two options and then have a single button to see the results of their choices. At this point it's reasonably straightforward to include more drill-through target pages and update our system to allow the user to select those new pages. So I'm going to head back to my films by region page, right click on that and choose to duplicate it. And then let's change its name to say something like films by studio. And then let's just update what we're displaying in the actual page itself. So I'm going to select my chart, and I'm going to take away the region field and then replace that with the studio field from the studio table. And then similarly, I'm going to go to my table, which I can't even see the region name there. I'm going to take out the region field and I'm going to replace that with studio in the table as well. We've got a lot more space on the page now, so we can actually make use of that space by increasing the size of the table in the chart. But there we go. So now the problem is, how do I add the studio option into my slicer system? I need to modify the values in the page picker table. And of course I can't just do that simply by heading into the data view and typing those values in. In order to do this, I need to modify the query that's been used to generate that table. So in the fields list, I'm going to right click on page picker and then choose edit query. This is going to launch the Power Query Editor, which allows me to modify the queries used to import or link to any of the tables in my entire data model. So here I'm looking at the page picker table on the left hand side, and here are the steps that have been applied to generate that table. So next to the word source on the right hand side is a little cog or gear symbol. And if I click on that little cog or gear, it will launch the Create Table window that we saw earlier on. So I can add a new row now. I'm going to enter a label of Studio and then enter my page name very carefully, Films by Studio. Of course, if you made any mistakes previously, this is where you can come to edit those mistakes as well. So at this point, having added in that new row, I can click OK to update my table. And then I finally need to click this Close and Apply button in the Power Query Editor to take me back to Power BI Desktop itself. Okay, so we can see that the slicer's increased its size. It's got a new item listed in there now, Studio. And if I pick a single genre and I pick a page to go to, I'm going to go for Studio and then Control and click on my button. It will take me to my new page happily as well. So there we go, there's the entire system in place with a single button to click on to deal with any combination of choices I make. So there we go, there's a few examples of using the HasOneValue, Values and SelectedValue functions. We'll see a few more examples of this disconnected slicer feature in a later video, but first of all in the next video we're going to have a look at how we can concatenate lists of values in a measure. So I hope you're looking forward to that one. Thanks as ever for watching this one. See you next time.